Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. And you know the rules, go and get yourself something really fantastic to drink, whether it's something sparkling and effervescent or something warm and comforting, because it could be very cold for you wherever you are, so you want to keep nice and warm. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it was the 1960s. I was driving my father's blue, rather beat-up VW microbus down the family's long dirt driveway that was now liberally sprinkled with the last of the decaying leaves from an autumn now past. It would seem a cruel winter had gripped our rural North American town with a fierce vengeance, determined to strip the countryside bare of all its vibrant colour and to rob the once viridescent green grass of its beguiling allure, like a painter stripping off the layers of varnish just to get back to the original wood, which looked nothing like the finished polished result. The countryside was drab and uninviting, tainted with that fatigued, washed-out, dreary brown look, where everything looked exactly the same, the trees rudely naked, their skeletal boughs devoid of any modesty, their lofty silhouettes once proudly boasting opulent green finery, stabbed the smouldering pewter sky like jagged, uncongenial claws. I loathed this time of the year, when the countryside became like an artist's bland canvas that was begging for a splash of vibrant colour. Of course, when the first snows of the season arrived, the landscape became beautiful once again, like a gleaming white rose, with piercing, sharp, jagged thorns, as snow, although dramatically breathtaking, could be deceptively treacherous. I always found that the in-between interval, from the end of autumn to the beginning of winter, was the most uncongenial time of all. The tired-looking environment was like the naked emperor who realizes to his horror that he's wearing no clothes. The weather was hostile, relentlessly stubborn at this time of year, its desire to lay the washed-out environment hostage to its charge. It would seem that the soft pitter-patter of spring seemed a long way ahead in the future, even if it was only a few months away. I had been out of town for a couple of days to visit my girlfriend Madison Riley in a neighbouring state, but things had ended badly when she told me it was over between us and she'd met someone else. She had told me this when I was about to leave at the end of a pleasant weekend we'd spent together. I was actually heartily relieved about this, as I had been clandestinely wanting to end things with her a long time ago. But hand on heart, I'd never had the guts to do so, as I was reluctant to hurt her feelings. She had saved me the trouble, but it still irked me that I'd been so quickly replaced with someone else. Let's just say that was a monumental blow to the male ego, and a nasty kick to the guts. "Who is he?" I'd asked her. "No one you need to know about," she had said. I remember my cheeks began to burn like hot coals as I got into my father's truck, while Madison stood at the end of the driveway, waving me off with a smug look of satisfaction on her face, as if she was delighted to get rid of me at long last. I remember almost cursing her as I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. My hands held the steering wheel so tightly that the whites of my knuckles began to show. Is this what it felt like to be dumped, even when you'd wanted to be dumped all along? But when it actually happened, it was a dreadful feeling. I put on some very depressing music on the radio to echo my lugubrious mood. I should be happy that things had ended with Madison, but why did I feel like someone had flung a wrecking ball at my life? The pale blue microbus I was driving belonged to my father, but had inadvertently become mine since I used it so frequently over the last couple of years and had taken it over. I barely remember the journey home, as if I'd driven on autopilot, with my mind 1,000 miles away, to thoughts of who the mysterious man was who had won over Madison's heart. Why was I feeling like this? I was glad to have let her go. The van rattled precariously, jolting and juddering unsteadily, as it approached our familiar, perfectly symmetrical farmhouse, with box sash windows, pale green shutters, and a coal-coloured slate roof that was nestled contentedly against the distant backdrop of the smouldering sculptural mountains that in the furthest distance looked like they were all but smudged like a blue-grey blur on the horizon, sprinkled magnanimously with a light scattering of snow. Sometimes on dreary cold winter days, the mountains became as ashen as the sky itself. Let's just say our charming family home, along with a few of its outbuildings, embodied all the happy, indelible memories of my childhood, like an exciting picture book of colourful drawings, but it also held in its steadfastly secure grasp empty pages filled with the reassuring promises of pictures still to be drawn. The cheerless, biting winter conditions had clawed its steely hold over the shorter days of winter, so this day was reluctantly slinking away like a disgraced debutante into the crepuscular darkness of early evening. What was left of the sunshine had slipped away very discreetly, so you barely noticed it had been there at all. I parked my truck next to my father's fancy-looking gold Thunderbird. My rather battered old van, or rather my father's old van, looked only fit enough for the knacker's yard next to his showy car. My father was so proud of that Thunderbird. He'd polish it up to perfection with his chamois every opportunity he got, and delighted in driving it showily through town whenever he got the chance. Today it was sitting stoically under the carport in the driveway, as if it hadn't moved for 24 hours, its engine very cold, its bonnet covered with a scattering of dust. As my engine shuddered and ground to a grumbling halt, I glanced briefly at our family home. The unilluminated house stared back at me vacantly, with a nonchalant indifference, but something seemed off about it. I was overcome with a gripping uneasiness that nudged me like an icy cold hand. I decided that my breakup with Madison had hit me harder than I'd envisaged. I was clearly not taking rejection very well. Or did I like Madison more than I cared to admit, and was secretly jealous of the new man whom had won over her heart? Being rejected happens to us all, I told myself gingerly. Now for God's sake, get a grip. You wanted things to be over, so quit being downcast about it. You're a free man. Somehow, despite all the encouraging self-talk, I didn't feel free at all. On the contrary, I felt almost as if I was grieving the loss of my relationship with Madison, as if she'd died. I mean, I had dated Madison for over 2 years, and the finality of our relationship coming to an end seemed so final. I glanced at the family farmhouse, hoping it would offer me the measure of comfort that home always did. My safe, secure sanctuary, the soft place to fall. A place where your family loved you unconditionally, no matter how unlovable you might be. A faithfulness you got from few other relationships in your life. The house was peppered in the gloom of early evening, but the stiff silence that encompassed the entire house, like a tenebrific halo, was palpable. Why did this disturbing silence scream out to me with non-verbal words that clung to me like a hostile chewing gum that could not be shifted? Why were there no lights on in our family home? It was common for lights to be twinkling through every room of the house at this time of the early evening. My mother never switched off light bulbs when she meandered from one room to another, something that always annoyed my father, who claimed she was wasting electricity. The evening carried in its weighty arms the inauspicious sense of foreboding. The curtains in all the windows had failed to be drawn. The shutters weren't closed, which was exceedingly unusual. Everything was cloaked in a thick, foggy, oppressive gloom. The faint, faraway silhouette of a white moon sat ominously on the roof of the sky, waiting for that golden moment to become central stage of the infirmament's auditorium, when the gunmetal grey sky changed its overcoat to a much darker one, so that the moon's subdued demeanour would soon acquire a pearly glow. As I stared up at my childhood home, something felt horribly wrong. It was like a gut instinct pulled at my heartstrings, and for a brief second I froze to the spot, gawking at the house as if viewing it for the very first time through the discerning eyes of a stranger. Normally our large, maladroit dog Tyson, an ungainly, clumsy bundle of fur that was all legs, who was an Irish greyhound cross, would be making a big commotion by now when he heard my truck in the driveway, He'd be scratching at the door frantically to get out, barking furiously to alert the house to my arrival, but there were no barks coming from the house. In truth, I was expecting the front door to be flung open by my father, followed by Tyson, who would come flying out of the doors like a rocket launched on padded paws. But there was no sign of him anywhere. By now, this rambunctious furball should be ungraciously knocking over everything in his path just to get to me. But I was just greeted to an unwelcome still silence that sent chills down my spine. I unwillingly climbed out of the minivan with a vacillating hesitancy, my reluctant boots dragging the pebbles beneath their rubber soles, creating that crunching sound. The trepidation that overcame me was one of impending dread. I staggered awkwardly to the front door, very afraid of what I would or would not find. I turned the doorknob slowly, and the door squeaked open. It wasn't even locked. I fumbled around for the light switch on the wall, and when I found it, I hastily switched on the light. I went through every room in the house, switching on all the lights and calling out my parents' names. Sadie! Mum! Dad! Tyson! But once again, I was greeted to a cold, uncongenial silence. No one was at home, and yet my father's Thunderbird was still parked in the carport. If my family had gone anywhere, they would have had to leave the property on foot, but that was very unlikely and distinctly out of character. I noticed my sister's bed was still unmade, which was very unusual, as she'd never leave the house without making her bed first. It was when I entered the kitchen that I was struck by how hot the room was, and that was when I noticed the electric hob was burning away brightly. It was an orange colour. I could see a saucepan of water on the countertop next to a large open box of porridge oats, along with 3 empty porridge bowls on the table. That was when the horror hit me like a large slap in the face. My mother must have been making breakfast earlier on in the morning. That was many long hours ago. Something had disturbed the family before they'd had breakfast. But what? She had left the hob on, and the family was gone. I knew in that dreadful moment that something awful had transpired. I wasted no time in calling the police. It was the next day, while the woods were being combed by police, that a detective inspector called Duncan Ross came to speak to me personally about the whereabouts of my family. I was soon to realise that as the only family member apparently alive and well, I was now being placed under a cloud of suspicion, as if I might have something to do with their bizarre disappearance, and so my relationship with my family was almost placed under a microscope. Duncan Ross was a very shrewd man who didn't miss a trick, and he was made for police investigation, like a duck is made for water. The moment the man entered the house wearing his parka coat, he looked every bit the quintessential detective. His shrewd brown eyes examined everything, like a computer scanner, and finally they settled on me with a steely, hawk-like gaze. I would say he was in his early 50s or 60s, with dark brown hair, growing grey at the temples, and receding on the crown area of his head. "So your name, for the record?" "I'm Howard Graham. I'm the oldest member of my family. My sister Rachel is about 18 months my junior." "How old are you, Howard?" "I'm 25, I told him. "So could you tell me exactly what happened?" asked the officer, his beady eyes focusing on me with a bird-like intensity. I knew he was looking for any signs of guileful body language on my part that might expose any deceit or treachery. I knew in his eyes I was a prime suspect, and that was not a good feeling. I wanted my family to be found as much as he did. It was difficult not to feel nervous under such intense scrutiny. I was feeling guilty about a disappearance that had nothing to do with me, but the inspector was making me feel as if I was wholly responsible for my family's vanishing. It didn't help that I appeared unemotional and detached. For some reason my emotions were momentarily suspended, as if held back on the back burner for another time. I knew if I allowed myself to dwell on what might have become of my family, I could easily just break down into tears, and I knew I needed to hold it together. "Look, officer, all I know is I spent a couple of days at my girlfriend's house, out of state. If you don't believe me, you can check up with her. Her name is Madison Riley. I returned home to find the farmhouse in silence. Our dog Tyson was gone, along with my family. The hob had been left on for breakfast, but someone disturbed their meal, so not even the porridge got cooked. The Thunderbird, which belonged to my dad, was still parked in the parking bay. They would not have left the house without using their car, so I don't know where they've got to. I am as nonplussed as you are. Mr. Graham, we have thoroughly checked the woodgrove on your behalf, and your property and outhouses have been thoroughly searched. My officers are now knocking on nearby farmhouses in the local area to ascertain if anyone heard or saw anything unusual yesterday that was remotely suspicious. We have not uncovered any signs of foul play, no blood droplets or anything. It would seem your family has just vanished off the face of the earth without explanation. And I am not a man that takes very kindly to mystery, Mr. Graham. There is always a reason why a family vanishes. I must ask you some uncomfortable questions, I'm afraid, he said, rubbing his chin awkwardly. Do you know if your parents or your sister had any enemies that might wish to do them harm? I laughed at the officer. Are you kidding me? My parents don't have any enemies. Absolutely not. They were the salt of the community. There is no one who would want to hurt them. Detective Ross jumped on the words were, like a cat diving onto a mouse, rendering it helpless. Why do you say were, Mr. Graham? Is there something you're not telling me? You are speaking of your parents in the past tense. You do realize that? I could feel the bile rising up in the back of my throat, and an unbridled anger surfing through my veins. How dare you, Inspector Ross? I piped. I have no idea where my family are. If you must know, I fear the very worst has happened to them. So I'm sorry if I'm speaking about them in the past tense. But what am I supposed to conclude when I don't know where the hell they've got to? I know in my gut something bad has happened to them, and I'm not sure they're still alive. If they are alive, someone would have seen them, surely. Something is terribly wrong. And instead of quizzing me, Inspector, you need to find out what the hell is going on and what has happened to my family. You should be looking for them right now as I speak, not questioning me like this. It was in that moment that a huge bundle of fur came dashing and bolting into the farmhouse, running towards me, with a grinning police officer following closely behind. Before I knew it, I'd been covered with hundreds of licks from his long, pink, wet tongue, while his enthusiastic tail thrashed all over the place. Tyson was so glad to be back home, but where on earth had he been? Someone's pleased to see you, said the officer. Where did you find Tyson? I asked incredulously, wrapping my arms affectionately around my rapturous dog. Someone found him wandering around town, looking hopelessly lost. A woman called Mrs. Robinson claims the dog belongs to your family. But the question is, how on earth did your dog end up in town? It's at least 30 minutes away from your farmhouse. I have no idea. I'm as mystified as you, I said. I wish I could speak to your dog, said Detective Ross. Maybe he could give us some insight into what happened to your family. The longer we're left without any answers, I'm afraid to say the more grim the long-term outlook is. The detective sighed as he looked at me warily through his steely grey eyes. I've worked as a detective for over 27 years, Mr. Graham. I have found my instincts have never failed me yet, and I have a good feeling about you. I believe you are telling me the truth about your parents, and that you have nothing to do with your family's disappearance. But something untoward happened to them. I believe that unbeknown to you, that you might in fact hold the missing link to this paradoxical mystery that may help us uncover what happened to your family. I need you to think about this very carefully, Mr. Graham. Something disturbed your family at breakfast yesterday morning, when your mother was preparing porridge. But what? I cannot imagine. We searched your house for any signs of a robbery, but your mother's jewellery is still intact in her jewellery box, with expensive pieces accessible to any opportunist, but nothing was taken.
There is also a sizable amount of money, I've noticed, in a glass jar on the kitchen shelf over there. That was not taken either, and is very conspicuous to anyone who's got money on his mind. This leaves me to conclude that whoever arrived on your family doorstep yesterday morning, at breakfast time, was not there to steal from your family. So they clearly had some other alternative, or axe to grind, so to speak. But the question is what? My bet is the perpetrator knew your dog Tyson, so he dropped him off in town for someone else to find. I also believe this man, whoever he is, knows your family rather well. Are you sure there is no one who has had an unfortunate altercation with your parents? Someone they might have offended, perhaps? I want you to really think about this, Mr. Graham. You could easily have overlooked something. I don't know of anyone who'd want to harm my family, I said. I know my mother hasn't spoken to her sister Isla in years, but I'm sure this kind of thing happens in families a lot. I know they fell out over something trivial when my mother was in her 20s, and they've never spoken to each other since. Isla lives in Boston. She's got a superior stuck-up attitude. She's married to a university professor and thinks she's better than everybody else. I used to see her at Thanksgiving and Christmas. My mother barely exchanged pleasantries. After my grandparents on that side of the family died, well, they never saw each other again, as the Christmases and Thanksgivings spent with that part of the family came to an end. I know I have a couple of cousins, 2 girls my aunt birthed about 15 years ago, but I've never met them before. Good, Graham, you're thinking outside of the box. But do you really think your mother's sister Isla hated your mother enough to wish her harm? Said the inspector, looking doubtful. No, absolutely not. Isla may be stuck up, vindictively snobbish, full of her own self-importance and the trappings of a luxurious lifestyle. But I assure you she's not a murderer. She'd never harm her sister. They might not have any time for each other anymore, but that's about it. I don't think she'd wish my mother any harm. And your father? Has he offended anyone that you can think of? Anyone that would want to harm him? Well, he did have a couple of disgruntled employers working for him, who were pilfering on the job, so he sacked them on the spot. I know one of the men was begging for his job back, but my father refused, saying that once the trust is broken, it can't be repaired. I remember the man told my father he'd live to regret it, and he needed to watch his back from now on, that he was dead, well, a dead man walking, so to speak. But I think he was just venting his anger. He was upset for being sacked. I don't think he really meant to act out on his threats. But then again, what do I know? So you say your father sacked this man at the hardware store that he runs in town? Is that right? That's right. Most of the staff he's hired over the years have been diligently loyal and honest. But you always get 1 or 2, don't you, that will invariably let you down, who just can't resist dipping their hands into the till. And my father will usually let them go. You can't hire people you don't trust. Of course you can't. This man who started issuing threats to your father, what was his name? Said Detective Ross, pulling out his pen and paper and scribbling down some notes. I think his name was Tiger. That's what everybody called him. I'm not sure what his real name was. He was a bit rough around the edges, but my father said he was harmless. I met him a few times. I could not imagine him harming my family. My father was never worried about the threats. He said it was all just hot air. You would be very surprised, Mr. Graham, very surprised indeed. Some people don't issue idle threats for nothing. If they might indeed seem idle at the time, but they might be anything but. I have seen people in my line of work killed over the silliest things. Some people act out on their fury, and losing a job can infuriate some people enough to bring about an impassioned desire to seek revenge. I'm going to need to speak to this Tiger character. He's a person of great interest in this investigation, it would seem. What about your sister, Mr. Graham? Has she upset anyone? Disgruntled boyfriends, perhaps, that might feel as if they've been thrown to the wayside? A lover spurned? You know the kind of thing I'm talking about. Let's see. My sister Rachel, she's quite pretty. She's never been short of admirers, so I'm sure she's turned down many boys over the years, and broken her fair share of hearts along the way. I know she did end things with her boyfriend recently. As far as I know, things ended amicably between the two of them, but then my sister doesn't rarely discuss her relationships with me. What was her boyfriend's name? The one she broke up with? Everyone calls him Falcon. I'm not sure what his real name is. How long did your sister go out with this Falcon character, Mr. Graham? I think about 8 months or so. It could have been longer. I'm not sure. Did you see them together as a couple? Of course. My mother invited Falcon around to the house quite frequently. He often joined us for family meals, but he was never very chatty. What was your impression of him? I looked up at the detective in surprise. I've never really liked any of my sister's boyfriends. She's got lousy taste in men. I tell her that all the time, of course. She seems to pick all the losers. I didn't like Falcon. He was a bit intense. I think he was much more into my sister than she was into him. I remember at dinner once he was holding on to her hands so tightly his knuckles were clenched, so that I could see the white showing. My sister wanted to push him away. She was struggling to eat with one hand. She giggled and said to him, "What are you like, Falcon? If you don't let go of my hand, I'll spill the spaghetti sauce all over you." I noticed my parents were giving each other rather wary glances, as if to say, "Look what we've got here. A man who won't let our daughter go." They didn't like the way Falcon was always possessively touching my sister, as if he owned her like a piece of property. He had to have his hand on her knee or on her shoulder or on her arm all the time, as if he was laying some kind of a claim on her. My mother said afterwards it was possibly because it was early days in their relationships. "Interesting," said Inspector Ross, rubbing a hand through his hair. "Unfortunately, as fathers, we can't always choose or dictate to our children who they choose to date. But I don't like the sound of this Falcon fellow. He was obviously obsessed with your sister, so he's another person of interest to this investigation. So when did this relationship end?" "I think it was a week ago." "Your sister said to you it had ended amicably, but you only have her word for it. How do you know this Falcon fellow is not nursing some very sore wounds brought on by feelings of rejection? I think I need to have some words with him." That evening, after meeting with Inspector Ross, my mind was naturally all over the place. I knew I was unlikely to get any sleep that night, if the past day was anything to go by. I was not an emotional person. I never had been. I'd learnt from an early age to rein in my tears, so I was surprised to find myself sobbing. I had this overwhelming sense of loss consuming me. I was certain I'd never see my family again. I was sure they were dead. I tried desperately to think what could have become of my family, but I kept drawing short straws much like the police. No one hated them enough to want to harm them, surely. But then, where were they? Graphically haunting images of my family lying in a shallow grave somewhere in the woodgrove tormented me. That evening, after my harrowing interview with the inspector, it turned out to be rather a cold night, with a blustering wind beating furiously against the panels of the farmhouse. I was sitting back on the couch, my feet cushioned under the great big fur ball of our family dog Tyson, who I believe could sense something was off, without my family around. He had become unusually subdued, as he slipped into a deep sleep. A cosy fire was crackling in the hearth. It spitted, popped and crackled, as the flames macerated the dry wood hungrily. The forlorn photograph album of family pictures was lying strewn at my feet. I had spent the last couple of hours sifting through family photographs and reminiscing. I had drunk a couple of bottles of beer to calm down my frenzied nerves. I slouched back on the couch, and my drooping eyelids surrendered to sleep. I think I drifted off for about 40 minutes or so. All of a sudden I was woken to a curious rapping sound. At first I thought it was the cherry tree on the side of the house banging at the eaves. Whenever the wind blew against the house, the cherry tree would bang noisily against the eaves. I soon realized that the knocking was precise, as if someone or something was knocking at the patio window, determined to get my attention. I immediately scuttled over to the sliding doors of the wraparound porch, where I believed the noise was coming from. I hurriedly grabbed my father's rifle, and of course a flashlight. Someone was out there. I was sure of it. My heart began to bounce around my chest, beating furiously. I stealthily pushed back the glass sliding doors that rolled back smoothly on their hinges. I stood on the wooden decking and glanced around me, but it was impossible to see a thing. The spirited wind whipped at my clothes, its icy fingers clawing ferociously at my skin. The sky was a velvety black, the stars obscure, like distant diamonds thousands of light years away. The ivory moon seemed bashful and demure, as it peeked through the tenebrous sky like a reluctant stranger. I flashed my torchlight around, only to be greeted by the dark, ambiguous shadows from beyond the patio. I could see the lofty silhouettes of the trees, the vegetation, the outside farm buildings, but not in detail. Everything was sucked up in this murky oblivion, so that shapes became distorted and almost menacing. I heard something tinkling, and then whatever it was landed very lightly on my boots. I reached down to the top of my leather boots to retrieve it. To my amazement, it was my mother's silver necklace, with a diamond heart-shaped pendant that she wore every day. It had been given to her as a present on her 20th wedding anniversary from my father, and she never ever took it off. Where did it come from? Was someone toying with me? My hands stiffened on the rifle. I was half expecting my family's abductor to show himself to me personally and appear out of the looming shadows. Perhaps he'd come to get me, to finish off the last surviving member of my family, with a blow to the head with a sawn-off shotgun. Perhaps I'd be joining them in a shallow grave. That was when something moved out of the shadows, causing me to nearly jump out of my skin. That was when I saw her, bathed in the full light of my torch. What I was seeing was not a regular human being. This was another human species staring at me through benevolent, deep-set dark eyes that portrayed an urgency. The hairy human being, whatever she was, looked rather reticently inclined, but she had shown herself to me on purpose. Of that I was most sure. I was so baffled by what I was perceiving that my mouth hung open and my eyes nearly popped out of my head. I think it was a bit like if I was a wild zebra seeing a horse for the very first time. I would sense it had much in common with me, but I would recognize its obvious differences. I knew right now I was looking at a human being that was remarkably different to myself in every regard, but also so incredibly similar. But her emotional intelligence was very apparent, and her kind expression cast away all my fears. The creature was female and intimidating in size and girth. She towered at a ponderous 8 foot tall and 4 foot wide across the shoulder area. She was covered in long flowing dark hair. I quickly pulled the sliding door shut, as I heard Tyson padding over to the door, barking excitedly. I didn't want him bolting out and jumping over this unsuspecting stranger. The creature's face was heart-shaped, with a prominent brow ridge that was heavily furrowed, a small flat nose, an angular jawline, and high cheekbones. I don't think she enjoyed the light of my torch scanning her so intrusively, but she held up to the scrutiny with a resigned acceptance, as if she understood my need to study her closely. I was holding the necklace in my hand that the creature had dropped at my feet. I knew it was her way of saying she knew exactly where my family was. She indicated for me to follow her, and I did so without hesitation. I thought she was going to lead me to graves of my family members. That's all I could think of. I could sense she wanted to help me. The creature, who I now know all these years later was a Bigfoot, led me to the woodgrove. I remember thinking my family are not here. If they were, the police would have found them. So I was mystified as to why she was taking me there. The forest was uncongenial, hostile even, But then again, I'd never ventured into the woodgrove late at night. It was bodefully airy. It felt as if the towering congregations of trees were whispering about me among themselves. Soon the creature had stopped outside a towering oak tree that I knew very well from my childhood. It was on the fringe of the woodgrove, in an area so often overlooked. It was where a forlorn-looking treehouse stood, that had long since been forgotten, and steps led directly towards the house, which were in a very bad state of repair. The treehouse had been built by my father's father, and we had played in it as young children, until my father had decided it was a safety risk. It was strange to think that when the police had been combing this area, looking for my family, they probably had not investigated the treehouse. But to be fair, it was very well camouflaged by the brown winter foliage. The creature pointed to the tree, and I heard the words in my head, "In there." She stood there watching me as I climbed up to the top of the treehouse, my foot almost getting ensnared in one of the weathered steps that cracked open when I stood on it. I reluctantly opened the door, and there, to my horror, I found two crumpled forms lying on the floor, with their hands and feet tied together. It was my father and mother, tied up like common criminals, looking as if they were half dead. I felt for a pulse and realized that my father and mother were still alive, seriously dehydrated and exceedingly cold. If I didn't get help now, they'd surely be dead. When I bolted out of the treehouse, the female Bigfoot was waiting for me. I thanked her for showing me the whereabouts of my parents. She nodded and glided away, while I returned home to call the police. They arrived on the scene promptly, and my parents were quickly ferried away on stretcher beds, covered in aluminium foil to raise their body temperatures. But who had put them in the treehouse in the first place? And where was my sister? My sister Rachel's account. It had been an ordinary morning. I woke up to hear my father whistling merrily in the kitchen, as he was putting down some dog biscuits for Tyson to eat at breakfast, and that dog, he eats his food so fast, I'm surprised he even tastes it. My mother was preparing our morning porridge, and had laid out 3 bowls on the breakfast table. She had put on the hob. Then we heard the knock at the door. My father welcomed the stranger into our house. I was horrified to see Falcon standing there. He was the last person I was expecting to see, and the last person I wanted to see. Things had not ended well between the both of us when I broke up with him. He hadn't taken it well, and had lashed out at me furiously, telling me I was the biggest bitch who had led him up the garden path, and I was going to pay for this big time, that I would be very sorry. I found him becoming increasingly possessive over me, and I was beginning to feel as if I couldn't breathe in that relationship. And if I ever spoke to another man, he became insanely jealous, so I wanted out of the relationship. I had avoided telling my parents the turbulent details of the breakup, but I knew seeing him standing there in the kitchen, with his glassy-looking eyes and a week's worth of stubble on his angular jawline, that something was seriously off about him. The man did not look in his right state of mind. He looked depraved and unhinged. I could tell at once that he had not changed his clothes in an entire week. He smelt rarely bad of body odour, and there was alcohol on his breath. In truth, I'm not exactly sure why my father had let him into the house. I sneakily suspected that Falcon had rudely broken past him and invited himself in. My mother looked incredibly anxious to see him in such a dishevelled state. She was physically shaking. He really did look like an escaped felon. "Hello, Falcon," she said. "To what do we owe this pleasure?" Her voice was not ringing with her usual cheerful friendliness. My father, immediately sensing something was wrong, was about to make a beeline for his rifle cabinet, when Falcon pulled out a revolver on us and told us to do exactly as he said. He forced my father to tie me up to the kitchen chair, and if he tried any tricks, he'd put a bullet straight through his head. "What is all this about, Falcon?" my father had said. "Can't we talk about this? We don't need violence in this house. If you want to know what this is about, why don't you ask Rachel, Mr. Graham? Your daughter does not want me any more. How do you think that makes me feel? She told me it was over between us, and she expects me to just accept that after everything we've been through together. I cannot live without your daughter, Mr. Graham, and I won't. Do you understand that? I won't. If she won't live with me willingly, she'll live with me unwillingly, but she'll live with me. I know it's hard, son, said my father, but people break up all the time. It's part of life, Falcon. You'll get over it. I'm sure there are lots of pretty girls out there that would love to go out with you. You better shut your trap, Mr. Graham. I'll blow your head off if you start talking like this. Do you understand? Now tie up your daughter to that chair. And if it's not tight enough, I'll put a bullet through your head. Do you understand that?
My mother was crying. Falcon told her to shut up.
Do you want me to blow your brains out, Mrs. Graham? Or are you going to cooperate?
Falcon, I cried out to him, tears spilling down my cheeks.
Why would you do this? Leave my parents out of this, please. They've done nothing wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have been so quick to break up with you after all. Let's talk about this, shall we? Sort out our issues. Maybe even get back together. But don't do this. Please don't do this to my parents. Don't lie to me, Rachel. I know you're toying with me, telling me what I want to hear in order to manipulate me. But I don't believe a word of it. Do I look like I'm daft?
The next thing I knew was that Falcon had taken my parents out of the house at gunpoint. I was screaming,
Falcon, please don't hurt them. Please don't. I'll do anything you want, but don't hurt my parents.
They were gone for a long while, and then I heard some distant gunshots coming from the woodgrove, and I knew Falcon had killed my parents. When he returned back to the house, he put me in the trunk of his car, with our dog on the back seat. He told me he'd killed my parents at point-blank range and hidden their bodies in the old treehouse, which I'd shown him once when I took him for a walk in the woodgrove in happier times when we'd been dating together.
You killed my parents! How could you do that? How could you?
I cried, spitting at him furiously like a viper and oscillating my arms backwards and forwards, but he untied me from the chair and flung me into the back of his trunk.
They were in the way, he told me. They needed to be eliminated. You're coming home with me, and I'm locking you up in my cellar until you become more compliant. I'll drop your dog off in town. I'm sure he'll find for himself a very nice home.
I was surprised he hadn't killed Tyson, but the dog had always been kind to him. Falcon tied me up in the cellar with a long chain so that I could walk around this damp, moulding living space on a small lead, like a dog. There was a bucket for my ablutions and a thin mattress covered with a pitiful blanket that would barely keep me warm. The place was teeming with spiders and rats. It was freezing cold down there. Falcon was refusing to give me food and water until I did exactly what he wanted me to do. He made no secret that this was part of his insidious plan, but it had only been a couple of days, and so I was still furious with him. I had no appetite for food, and when he came near me I spat at him and called him all kinds of names. He just grinned at me and said that in a few days I would be very malleable. I could see how in time that he'd beat me down into submission to do exactly what he wanted when I was hungry enough. I asked him, "Falcon, why are you doing this? This is crazy. Please let me go." He said if I wouldn't be his girl freely, then he'd force me to be his forever because he owned me, and he could not live without me, that I belonged to him. Imagine my surprise when the police arrested him on the property. They rescued me from the cellar and assured me that both my parents were recovering in hospital, but were suffering from dehydration and a touch of hypothermia. I couldn't believe they were alive, as I'd heard Falcon firing shots that I was certain had killed both my parents. That was what he wanted me to think, so that I'd be ever more terrified of him, and he would assume greater control over me. It would seem both my parents lost their voices from screaming so loudly for help, which had been a grievous mistake on their parts, as no one would have heard them. So when the police were searching for them in the woodgrove, they hadn't been able to cry out, as they had lost their voices. Their throats were badly parched, as they hadn't drunk anything for hours. They did try to get attention by stamping their feet, but the gale-force winds meant that the bangs that they made weren't audible to the police. One of the policemen spotted the old treehouse and intended to look inside it, but he got distracted and forgot to search the place. My parents claimed that on the second night of their incarceration in the treehouse, they heard something climbing up the ladder to the top of the treehouse, opening the door and letting out an audible gasp. They saw a tall, lofty figure standing there covered in long hair, with deep-set dark eyes, that they described as a hairy lady. She seemed so kind, also rather bewildered to see my parents. They begged her to get help for them, even though they were very weak, and were drifting in and out of consciousness, as it turned out that Falcon had given them both a rather nasty blow to the head, with the back of his fists. My parents knew that the hairy lady would not fail them. It was as if she understood what they were asking of her. My mother handed the Bigfoot her necklace. "Give that to my son," she said. "He'll know it's mine." The Bigfoot had nodded, and my mother was filled with a great peace. My parents were both certain that Falcon was going to shoot them dead on that day, in the wood grove, and leave their bodies for the scavengers to enjoy. They were very surprised to be bundled up in the old treehouse, with their hands and feet tied together. They thought they might be able to escape, but they couldn't remove the ties from their hands and feet, despite trying everything. The Bigfoot obviously decided to call on my brother for help, as both my parents were in a rather bad way. It was a few hours later that my parents were rescued and taken by ambulance to the hospital. The police asked Falcon why he had pretended to shoot my parents, and why he had left them bundled up in a treehouse like that. He claimed that when push came to shove, he couldn't pull the trigger. He decided after giving them both big bangs to the head that if he left them tied up in the treehouse, they would soon die of natural causes, like dehydration and hypothermia. He hoped this would take them out, rather than a bullet. I think he was reasonably confident that both my parents would die up there, but no one banked on the fact that my parents would be rescued by an ambiguous creature known as a Bigfoot. I was glad to see that Falcon faced charges of kidnap and attempted murder, and so he was locked away for a very long time.
"How did you know your parents would be found in the treehouse?"
my brother was asked by the inspector, to which he replied,
"I just realized it may not have been searched properly."
My brother didn't want to tell him about the hairy lady he'd encountered, as he knew that by nature she was reticently evasive and had stepped out of her comfort zone to help out our family. He decided not to blow her cover. Not that his account would be believed by the police, of course, and I doubt that one as evasive as her would be found against her will, although I hasten to say we never saw her again, but are forever grateful that she intervened in our lives, when her help saved our family from almost certain death, and me from becoming a slave to Falcon. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.